Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this joint webinar between GCW and CACI. We'll be providing sector specialist property opinion combined with CACI's customer expertise and data. We'll be focusing on what and how the new consumer mindset will mean for our town centres and which locations are best placed to capitalise from that. Please can questions be raised through the chat box at the bottom of the page, and we will answer all the questions at the end. I'll pass over to Alex, who's going to discuss the post-COVID consumer.
Always good to make sure you unmute yourself before we start speaking. Thanks, Holly. So let's get started. We're going to start with understanding the consumer. So this is sort of the plan for today. We're going to look at how the consumer and that customer has changed. We're going to focus on what the impact of that change is in terms of their spend, where they spend, what they spend, who it is who's spending. And then we're going to start looking at what that actually means for different for centres. And ultimately, we're going to both put our necks on the line, GCW and CACI, and say what we think that means for the future. So let's get started. I'm going to start off by talking about that customer. And I think I'll start by saying almost a slightly challenging question. Why should we care? Why is that consumer relevant? Well, as far as investments go, property is uniquely linked to people in place, and COVID has transformed both of those. So in the first instance, it's changed the way we move. It reframes where we go, it reframes when we go there, it reframes what we do when we're there, and what we think about places and how we behave in those places and what our engagement is with them. By changing the way we move and changing the way we engage with space, what that does is it changes what properties do. Offices need workers, homes need residents, and shops need customers. And if those workers, those residents, and those customers are all changing their behaviours, that impacts property. And that means that if people have changed how they engage with space and they've changed what's important to them and what motivates them, then the value of that space has also changed. And ultimately, what good looks like has changed. And that's why it's really important we understand what that post-COVID consumer is like. Or put it another way, people matter. And a new consumer reality means we, be it bids, councils, landlords, occupiers, agencies, we're all operating in a new commercial reality. So let's talk about that change in movement. This chart is from our weekly mobile tracker. It goes all the way back to the 8th of March 2020, and we're indexing mobility across the whole of the UK to that point. I'm not going to talk all the way through it, don't worry. But you can get an idea of how we as a nation have changed the way in which we move. We locked down hard in the first lockdown. We cut our movement. We stopped moving around down to 30% of where we were before lockdown. That slowly, incrementally rose through the summer. We topped out in mid-September at 82% of where we were back in March 2020. And then that's dropped away again as we've gone through the different lockdowns. We are due to get this week's numbers for what the first week of shops open looks like today. We were, prior to that, pushing up towards 79%, so we're expecting that rise to come back. But there's been this up and down swing over the last 13 months. It's ebbed and flowed, but it masks a lot of variation. So if we drill into this and start looking at it by centre type, we see that asset class becomes really important. So on this, we've got regional malls in green, and you can see they've been through a real roller coaster. Destination centres, comparison goods shopping, and dependent on what the restrictions were, has dictated whether or not people are literally going to them. So they're massively up just before Christmas and then dropping back down in lockdown, really up and down from 10% right up to 85%. Whereas the cities have been less peaky. And we see a really interesting thing coming through here where city centres, which have workers and tourists, are largely flatlining. They're not getting those people back in that were coming previously. Whereas the smaller the centres, the better that mobility and that footfall is held up. It's almost like there's a degree of small is beautiful here. And the reason for that is because those smaller centres are more local. They have their local residents who are coming to them, and they're more reliant on that local shoppers. They haven't lost those workers, those destination shoppers, those tourists like cities have. So this is great. But behind these numbers is mindset, because this is driven by what people feel. Fundamentally, we're talking about people's perception of space and reactions. And COVID has changed us. What we value from brands and what we want from brands is different. Where we choose to go is different, and how we spend our money is different. And that means every center is different. I'm going to look at what is driving those differences. I think the first thing that I'm going to highlight is that we have 3 trends which we're going to drill into, and all of these trends were already taking place. So what we've seen is COVID has accelerated that and moved us forward significantly. So the first is this idea of localism. We're spending more time in our communities and we quite like them. We want to support. The second is this idea that we're not actually equal. So yes, many trends have brought us together and we are seeing ourselves more as a community, but all these trends which have taken place are not necessarily felt equally. So we have also seen increasing fragmentation go on. Many of the existing divisions we had before COVID, in terms of age, in terms of affluence, in terms of lifestyle, those have deepened. So we're seeing a fragmentation of some group elements of society. Related to both of those is a transformation of spend. So what we buy, when we buy, what we spend, where we spend it, all of those things have changed. So I'm going to drill into each of those. If we start with this idea of community wellness, we're spending more time in our community, and in the pandemic, they were there for us. We like them. And as a result, we're seeing a little bit of a lifestyle restock, recognizing that putting people first means more experience, a little bit less consumption. And that's translating into us valuing community and supporting those local brands. So 2/3 of people are more likely to choose to shop in a local brand now than they were before the pandemic. We're also seeing ethics come into the decisions we make in terms of where we shop and what we choose to shop with. And this is environmentalism, it's sustainability, it's making sure you treat your workers right. So we're seeing brands that do right. 64% of people are more likely to choose those based on what their behaviours are and what those ethics and sustainability is. So those, point towards a greening of society. But equally, convenience is everything. 75% of us are more likely to choose brands we can easily source. And we're staying local. So, I find this map fascinating. This is the 16th of August last year, right at the peak of Eat Out to Help Out, great weather. And what we're looking at in this map is where the people of Bristol and what their movements were. So even though the city centre in Bristol has amazing restaurants all along the dockside, really busy, usually speaking, in old times, all of those restaurants promoting Eat Out to Help Out, we can say people still chose to stay local. They chose to stay in the communities. So that's why you see Bristol in that blue colours and the communities in red colours. Because actually, Eat Out to Help Out, they supported their local pizzeria. They didn't go into the big chains in the city centre, even though they were there, and that would have been their pre-pandemic behaviours. So we're doing shorter trips. We're more likely to use bikes or walking at the expense of cars and public transport when we're staying local. And this idea of localism, community, and this support for independence is right at the front of shoppers' minds. We think it's going to remain really important over the coming number of years. And we're going to have this front and centre compared to that pre-pandemic mindset. And we think particularly in rural areas, there's a long-term opportunity for high streets to once again become those thriving mixed-use spaces that they were in the past. In more urban areas, I think we may well see an opportunity for town shopping centres to be rejuvenated and a bit of a strategy of putting community at the heart of the town centre. But in both locations, it's a diversification away from just selling product. That's going to change. This also influences the way we work. It used to be that we spent 5 days in the office. Now we spend 5 days at home. Where we're going to ultimately end out is a blend of the two. We're estimating 2.8 days is what people on average want to say they're in the office. Let's call that 3, and 2 days per week at home. But it's what we do there that becomes important. So for young people, the office becomes a networking space, a socializing space. It's about learning. It's a collegiate opportunity to meet with colleagues. Similarly, for senior management, it becomes an opportunity to have FaceTime with people and to actually manage businesses. Home time then becomes where you go to get your head down. It becomes a space that you need to focus on. But in order to do that, you also need dedicated space to work in. So you don't want to be working with your dog beside you or a laptop on your knees. And for that reason, we may well see rising of co-working near homes, things that people can walk to, which give them a dedicated office space with good internet. And when we start thinking about what that means, if we're spending 3 days in the office and 2 days at home on average, it's got a lot of big impacts. For a start, daytime spend potential is going to flatten away from the cities and back to the suburbs and So we're going to see that big peak of all the money coming into the city and leaving again. That's going to flatten down a bit. And that means that the retail and the catering and the leisure facilities in cities is going to evolve. So we're going to see an evolution away from lots and lots of grab and go, so you can eat a sandwich over your desk, and potentially more opportunity for people to have engaged socializing. So you go into the office, so you can sit down with colleagues, and you can have lunch with colleagues. So we may well see an evolution of some of that space. Equally, town and local areas are going to see a rise of daytime engagement. We're going to see a change of use where people are going to the shops to get their supplies during lunchtime. And we may well see some of that grab and go starting to grow within those community areas. Either way, we're going to see a diversification of that space. Which all sounds great, but this isn't going to happen equally everywhere, because places are shaped and defined by the people who use them. And there are and remain differences between people. They are not universal. So whilst 44% of people across the UK have said, I'm going to make an effort to shop more locally than I do now, we see that actually that splits quite a lot. So 52% of affluent achievers are going to make that effort, but only 37% of urban adversity. So that's going to start having an impact. We, the people on this course, we're not representative. So 63% of workers are not desk-based. The majority of workers are not able to sit at home and dial in on their laptops. And as a result, they're not going to be able to choose when they go into the office. They're not going to have that 3-day, 2-day split. They're still going to have to be going into their place of work 5 days a week. So not every town is going to have this influx of commuters with loads of money in their pockets buying coffees at lunchtime. Some towns won't have any impact at all. And so it's important to understand who it is who is in a town. And equally, this idea of choosing a brand based on how sustainable it is, that's great. And there's 30% strongly agree that they would do that. But it varies. And this isn't an affluence thing. This is almost a lifestyle thing and a mindset thing. Because when we look at successful suburbs who are the definition of Middle England, it's only 18% would do that. Whereas that professional class, those professionals, is 37%. So we really do see those ethical considerations being made by different groups. All of these drive and impact where and how we spend. And that's what Freddie's going to talk about in a little bit more detail. Freddie, you there? Okay, I just had a message from Freddie, whose internet on his street has gone off, which is less than ideal. So I will rattle through his section and then hand over from there. So talking about spend, we've seen a shift in a number of areas in spend. I think the first point to make is that the total amount of money being spent in the UK during COVID has decreased. So we've seen a decline in total spend. On top of that, of the remaining spend, we've seen a shift in that spend towards a larger amount of spend being spent online. That means that the in-store spend has been impacted twice. Effectively, the size of the pie that's available has got smaller, but also the slice of the pie that is available to store spend has also decreased. So you've had that double whammy coming into play. Now, it's important to stress that this is not uniform across all products or all places. So, for example, we're expecting, as we come out of this year and moving forward towards 2023, a significant rebound in clothing and footwear spend, and an obvious rebound in catering spend as people bounce back and spend some of that pent-up money on those locations. So we expect both of those to rise notably. In contrast, we think house and home and durable goods are both going to slow for a few years. Because we've spent and brought forward a whole lot of expenditure in our homes and brought that forward in order to spend less, or sorry, do up the places we're spending our time and spend less on in the future. And that is good, and we will see clothing come back, but there is also going to be a step change in the amount of spend that's online, and that's going to be here for good. So the threat, if you like, to retail property has been accelerated. So we are expecting, basically pre-COVID, we saw circa 30% of all comparison goods spend online. as we move, as we were in lockdown, that rose to about 75%. We expect in the future to level out to about 40%. So effectively, there's been a step change in the amount of money that goes online, and that's long-term, here to stay. And that's going to have an impact, particularly on anyone who's doing turnover deals, which may seem attractive now. In the long term, we're going to see some of that get eroded. Behind that is, as we said, a shift and a difference between our shoppers and who they are. So we're going to see that you really need to understand who those shoppers are, and you need to deliver an offer that actually aligns to them. So in the first instance, we think there's going to be a short-term bounce back over the summer as some of those restrictions start to ease. As a whole, that's going to be really positive, and we're going to have sort of 2 to 3 months of great positivity. But from that point onwards, we think that we're actually going to start seeing certain areas having to rein that spending in. And we can see that, yes, there is a pent-up amount of money, but there are major differences between who it is who's going to be spending them. So this chart that you're looking at here is who feels they have less disposable income and who feels they have the same amount of disposable income and who has more. And it doesn't purely split along affluence, but there is absolutely an affluence split. These orange groups and these turquoise groups, who are the lower affluent groups, they are less confident about their money, whereas these blues and greens, who are your traditional community groups and more affluent groups, are more comfortable about and confident about their money. So we're going to see certain demographics start to pull away from one another. And the impact of that is really going to drive retail and retail spacing. So we have seen this step change in consumer behavior, and we've seen the consumer effectively accelerate away from, I suppose, the supply. And that's going to mean that retail centres are ultimately going to become more overspaced. So if we look at where we were in 2020, we already had a challenge. There was a lot of retail that was overspaced. And by overspacing, we're defining this as effectively the balance between the retail provision within a town or a location and the amount of money in the surrounding area that we would expect to be spent there. So if a centre has an above average amount of money per square foot effectively coming, then we would say that it's got headroom. If it's got a below average amount of money per square foot coming in, then we start to say it was overspaced. And it sits in between the two. So in 2020, we estimated that 44% of centres were overspaced. As a result of the change in spend, that shrinking of the pie and the bigger slice going online, we think that when we look forward to 2023, that's going to accelerate. So without intervention, and this is a crucial point, without anyone doing anything, we expect that 56% of centres will be overspaced. Now, if landlords are taking an active role to dial retail space down and start dialing office space up and so on, then that will shift the dial because you'll change the supply. But at the moment, this is where we expect it to pan out. So the crisis we were seeing in retail property before the pandemic has been accelerated. And we think that's going to carry on. Now, it's important to emphasize here, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. I'm hoping if there's one thing that's come through the slides I've just run through, it's that at the heart of it is recognizing that every centre is unique and understanding who your shoppers are, what they want from your location, your town, and what they want from shopping destinations, and then tailoring your offer appropriately to fit their needs. So I'm going to hand over now to Simon. Sorry, Ollie.
Thank you, Alex. Now GCW are going to provide some insights by overlaying CACI's data with our opinion as to the opportunities and challenges that locations face. Following on from Alex's point, the way people interact with property has changed, and therefore the purpose and hence the value has as well. As Alex just pointed out, not everywhere is equal. Places that look and feel similar will have very different trajectories of recovery. One of the key points there that Alex mentioned was that we predicted a rise of 56% of centres to be oversupplied retail by 2023, and therefore the question is how the centres resize their retail offer and how quickly it's going to be linked to their medium to long-term performance. And it all goes back to fundamentals as to why people engage with a place and how easily that built environment can adapt to the new consumer that we've discussed. It would be easy to pick some examples in the southeast, you know, your Guildfords with resi values of 500 pounds per square foot, but I'm going to try and pick some more interesting examples of Southampton and Nottingham, which sit in the same cohort of criteria of centres. They are actually very similar across several metrics: population, total spend, dominance. Both have wealthy hinterlands. Two university city towns with, say, 40, 50,000 students. Online penetration and tourist spend is actually almost identical. They've got similar footprints, both with John Lewis centres. And Nottingham is actually predicted to outperform this year and in the near term in terms of spend recovery. However, we believe over the next 3 to 5 years and potentially longer, Southampton will witness a stronger recovery due to its ability to react and correct the oversupply of retail in a way that complements the existing retail core. And that is predominantly driven by its geographical advantage and higher resi values, which are about 30-35% higher. When I say geographical advantage, I mean the actual layout of the retail. And Southampton is, the best way to describe it is almost like a capital T, with West Quay and Above Bar making the T. And what we'll see is the secondary locations, which are predominantly off that, the capital, the top of the T, will be repurposed and are already happening, with Bargate Shopping Centre being under offer for a large residential scheme. But those diversification of uses will enhance the retail core and actually tighten the pitch further. And we're already starting to see that happen. Whereas Nottingham has a very much a linear structure, and is bookended by the Victoria Centre and Broadmarsh at the north and south ends, with M&S and Primark anchoring the thoroughfares. The problem comes with disparate ownerships, and when secondary locations will be repurposed, because we've talked about the oversupply of retail, you'll end up with what looks like broken teeth and therefore fragmented cold spots that will weaken the long-term recovery of Nottingham. We're not, just to be clear, we're not saying that Nottingham is going to fail, far from it. We're actually big fans of locations like Clumber Street, but I think what we're saying is that there'll be locations like Bridlesmith Gate in Nottingham, which used to be one of the prime pitches, need to be reimagined and almost taken back to once it was, which was a unique, attractive location for independence. And actually, if you could start Bridlesmith again and take it back to what it was, you could almost create a new quarter, a bit like the lanes in Brighton. So I think the message that we're saying is, yeah, everywhere is different, but there's not just a simple equation of every town will be better with 25% less retail in its centre. Actually, what's just as important is where and how those centres are going to repurpose, and how are those other uses going to complement the retail core.
Ollie's given us two good city centre examples, but I think it's also important to reflect that the change that we're going to see is going to affect everywhere. And I think, kind of echoing what Ollie's just said, we don't believe that any town is going to die, but ultimately everywhere is going to be different. And the requirement for change is going to be on a different, further along the spectrum for different places. And again, looking at two larger local towns that have similar characteristics, we've picked out Leamington Spa and Northampton, but to an extent, these are interchangeable. And what we're keen to try and avoid is that this is a success is based on affluence. That's absolutely not the case at all in our view. It's based around relevance. And what that catchment does is so important. If you look at the comparison between both the two towns, they've had a similar retail offer over time, if you believe in department stores or large stores as being a kind of barometer. Both have had House of Frasers, both have had M&S's, both have had Debenhams. back in the early mid-2000s, Northampton was mooted as a potential location for a John Lewis. So whilst you might say that the affluence score isn't quite as high as Leamington Spa, the volume of people should make up that. And as you say, if you believe in John Lewis as a barometer, or then their discussions at that moment in time would suggest that the two towns are comparable. But if we move on to just look at Leamington in isolation, identity is a big part of it. Leamington has an identity and a relevance to its catchment, and actually it goes beyond that. It draws beyond that natural catchment. Like Northampton, it has a similar amount of competing centres that sit around it. So for Leamington, you've got Stratford-upon-Avon for a tourism element. You've got Solihull in terms of a comparison fashion offer. You've got Birmingham, and to an extent you have Coventry as well. Northampton, Milton Keynes, and Rushden Lake. So they're both fighting to retain or capture their customers. But Leamington's doing that and punching above its weight, arguably. It's not just retaining its catchment, it's drawing from beyond it. Whereas if we look at Northampton, it isn't. That catchment's ebbing away, and it's struggling to service and retain even its natural catchment. So what are the differences, and what are the differences beyond identity? Well, Northampton's been a victim, in our opinion, of poor planning over time, and certainly friction between the local authority and the private sector over the future and direction, particularly of the town centre. The poor planning I refer to is the ring of out of town, which sits in very close proximity to the town centre. Certainly, there are instances where people park in the out of town and then walk into the town centre, which it's already creating a high degree of competition. Its spend has therefore leaped away, whereas when we look at Leamington's got strong residential catchment, which actually sits within 100 metres of the town centre. So it's easy for those people to already engage with it and come into it. That ring road in Northampton has acted as a barrier to people coming into the town centre. And whilst it sounds ridiculous in the times that we're in talking about the relevance of the car, it is true that if you've got to get in the car and go to a place, it's got to offer you a reason to do it. Otherwise, the gravity model works that it will pull you further away to somewhere that's got a better, more attractive offer. And that offer isn't just about quantum of retail. We need to accept that the reason why people go to places, particularly towns of the size that we're talking about at the moment, retail isn't necessarily the primary reason for their visit. It's an important part of it, and it's a stumbling block which they meet as they're engaging with residential living, education, medical, and other leisure uses. So concluding our views on both of these towns, or these types of towns, undoubtedly both have issues. One, in terms of Leamington Spa, is there's an oversupply and there's a required contraction in terms of the traditional retail offer. But the other is more fundamental. Northampton needs to find its place in the world, and it needs to reposition itself. It's fundamentally got too much comparison, or tried to have too much comparison shopping. And as a result, it's lost. It's, to use a football analogy, it's in the relegation zone of the league, but perhaps it's in the wrong league in the first place. And that's a difficult message, but it's something that's important for us to consider. I'll hand you back over to Alex.
Thanks, Simon. So to start wrapping up, and I think this is where we collectively start to put our necks in the line a little bit, we thought it'd be worth looking at some predictions and looking at what town centres and the future town centres might be. So I think the first one is, let's take a short-term view. Let's look at 2021. there is going to be a growth in spend. There's going to be more spent as that pent-up demand is unleashed. We're going to particularly see a rise on clothing and footwear, and also a rise on catering. It's important to note that that surge in spend as people re-engage with society is going to be on both on and offline channels. So it's not going to be like there's a massive swing away from online. People are still going to be spending online, but they will also be engaging and re-engaging with stores and spending offline as well. That, I think, will slowly start to ease away as we move further through the year. And as we start taking a longer term view in terms of what that looks like and what people's expectations are, this idea of a focus on ethical and sustainable consumption, choosing brands that matter, that's here to stay. And we've seen that throughout the course of the last 13 months. Leading into it, we had those trends already underway. We had the rise of XR. We saw the Boohoo scandal in the early stages of the pandemic. We will see, as we move on, that people will start engaging more and choosing those ethical brands and those local brands. And brands are recognizing this and changing it and emphasizing their credentials in that sort of space. So we'll definitely see that coming through. But, and I cannot stress this enough, there will be fragmentation. This fragmentation is going to be across age. So we're already seeing differences appearing between Gen Z, between your boomers, between millennials, and those divisions coming up. And I use those terms very, very loosely because as someone who specializes in demography, I prefer far more precision. But there are general trends where we have seen quite clear divides in ethics and outlook across those different age groups. Because they've experienced the pandemic in very different ways. And that will pay as we move through move out of this and move into a re-emergent society, as it were. We will also see geographic divides coming in. Now, those geographic divides, it's a real chicken and egg scenario as to whether the affluence is driving the geography or vice versa. But there will be shifts in geography. As Simon and Ollie just talked about, there are differences between the infrastructure, between the people who live around, between how those towns and cities across the UK are laid out. And that means every town and city is unique, and you need to understand the unique peccadillos, as it were, of both what is there in terms of supply and provision, but also demand in terms of what people actually want from that space. And one of the things that I think really comes through, particularly in town centres and particularly in communities, is a desire for more diversified centres. So death of the clone town, death of the clone store. Absolutely, we will still shop in those big mass market brands. I'm not predicting the end of mass market comparison with retail, not by any stretch. But I think what we will hopefully see a shift away from is a high street where it's exactly the same set of brands on that high street as it is in the town down the road, as it is in the retail park out of town, and the fit out and the stock in all those locations is the same as well. And that's kind of where we were pre-pandemic. What the pandemic has done is it's realized an opportunity to diversify some of those. So we have seen this growth and overspacing within town centres. That's here to stay. The result of that isn't to try and get more people to come in to use that space up. It's to look at that space and work out how we can better use that space. And that could be through diversifying it into, and there obviously has to be a degree to which you try and maintain value in those locations as well. But that could be diversification to residential space, but it could also be working with the local communities and local councils to deliver things such as flexible office space, if you happen to be a commuter town. Or it could be pulling medical supplies in, or looking at how these areas are evolving and making sure that as anyone who is operating or working in that space, you are nimble enough to react to that local market and to deliver something above and beyond, rather than just chasing the highest possible zone A rent, which I think historically was driving and motivating a lot of decisions that were being made. And fundamentally, customers will reward innovation. Places that do actually have the ability to blend that daily need with something which is interesting and engaging will succeed in getting visitors to return. Ultimately, what we're looking to do, and what anyone wants to do, is to drive footfall and drive engagement. And if you know that you can get your daily supplies there, be it grocery, be it children's wear, new shoes for the kids or whatever, as well as going there to work or grabbing a coffee or having a Saturday market, is that diversification, that blend of engagement that is going to keep people coming back. And ultimately that, for town centres, is where we think the focus really needs to sit, is creating places that reflect their communities rather than where we've been in the past, which has been a little bit more cloning. Simon?
Thank you. So evolution or revolution, it's elements of both. But what trends are we seeing? Well, we've been spending a lot of time talking to some of the leading estate agencies, particularly in London. So name checking Dexter's in terms of trying to understand what they're seeing in terms of people movements around sales and rentals. And the feedback that they're giving us, which is obviously a London-based example, but we think it's translatable, is a move where the most affluent are moving closer to work. And that is, when I say the most affluent, that is a very microcosm of society. So in London, that's the move to zone 1 to be within very easy walking distance of work. But for the majority, and that's the majority where office-based work is the primary income driver for the household, they're seeing a move, particularly from the middle zones in London to the outer zones and beyond. And very simply, referring back to Alex, if people are in the office less often, they're prepared to spend more time commuting for what is a bigger house, a bigger piece of space, and what we're seeing though when we're spending time in these places and we're investigating it, is that whilst people are moving away from that urban location, they still have a requirement for their urban experience. Their desire hasn't diminished, and actually their expectation of the towns and the villages that they're moving to is that much higher. And that very much accords with the point that Alex was just making around actually local, independent, diverse businesses are what the consumer wants. And that creates a bit of a sort of shift in balance of power. And it's something that retail occupiers particularly, have seen, that historically, or more recently, retailers have been able to dictate to the consumer how goods are purchased, how they're displayed, and there's very much been historically a come to us mentality. The internet disrupted everything to the point where the consumer went back to being king, and occupiers have had to change their model so that they're following the consumer and adapting to how they're choosing to engage with their brand. And the same is true in this urban to suburban theme, which we're very much seeing, is that the consumer, the brands, and the best brands, be they independent or national, are identifying this trend and starting to move with them. Now, there's some really easy examples in terms of what you're seeing Pret or Wasabi or people like Rosa's Thai do in terms of moving out. But equally, independently, you're seeing the same. And to sort of, I'd appreciate that's another grab and go example in terms of food. But as Alex makes the comment that offices, maybe there'll be slightly less grab and go culture in the office, and that actually people will be sitting around a table and having lunch. When they're at home, they're not seeing they're actually still they still have a desire for that experience that they've had in the cities. And anecdotally, on almost all of the projects where we're within 50 miles of the M25, we have interest from independent sushi bars. And when you're speaking to those independents, it's exactly that theme. It's that they want to follow their customer and satisfy that requirement. And we see that panning out in a larger way. And it's interesting JLP strategy, if we can understand it. And when you take on board some of the comments that they've made around trying to get the John Lewis product and the John Lewis brand closer to their consumer, it's a theme that's been demonstrated internationally as well. So if you take Nordstrom in the US, what Nordstrom have done to get closer to their consumer is they have a smaller model. They've got a curated version of their store in sub 15,000 square feet that they're choosing to locate absolutely where their core customer is. They're being pinpoint focused on it. And whilst JLP are choosing to do it through Waitrose, and personally I've got some views as to whether that's the strongest way to do it, but I could see a situation where, again, they seek to target their customer by taking a smaller store precisely where they are. And we're seeing that in terms of a lot of the discussions that we're having with occupiers. A lot of the strategy that they're pinpointing is absolutely trying to discover who their purest customer is and locating as close as possible to them to drive that loyalty and reward it. Another core value is one of identity, which ultimately underlines everything, and we've touched on it when we've talked in the examples around that we've used in terms of towns. The size and purpose of a place is irrelevant without identity. It's what creates the innate connection within us. It's the magnetic attraction, and it's the engagement. And those places that have strong identities will be those that recover fastest from the situation that we found ourselves in over the last 12 months. Some examples of that would be Cardiff and Liverpool at a city level. Yes, one of those is a national capital, but that's kind of the point. It's the fact that there's something in that place which is drawing people to it, to the point where they will travel further to it, or they'll spend longer time there, or they'll choose to actually relocate to be closer to it or be within it and be a part of it. Those places which resonate and have identity will be the winners. Norwich and Lincoln, likewise, may be easy examples because they're more geographically isolated than some other places. And on a smaller basis, trying to move away from examples that we've maybe used historically in the southeast, an Ilkley or a Hebden Bridge, potential commuter locations, opportunities to get to both Leeds and Manchester, strongly resonate with their catchment. They've got very clear senses of identity, which any one of us, if we went there, would feel without having spent lots of time there. But I suppose what that does is it makes us reflect on purpose of a place. If I'm saying, as I have, that successful places are drawing beyond their catchment, it's not mathematically possible for everywhere to draw beyond their catchment all of the time. And so there have to be places which can't. And those places must fight their hardest to try and retain their catchment. But some places, as we've indicated with Northampton, are maybe in the wrong category. Maybe they're unremarkable. Maybe they don't have that connection. And an example of that, just to go on, might be Peterborough, particularly with the loss of a John Lewis. Does it need to be the offer does it need to have the offer that it does at the moment? And actually, isn't there an opportunity for these places to become strong, local, convenient centres? And convenient doesn't mean no comparison offer. It means a more relevant comparison offer, which resonates with their catchment. And that's the step change which we need to see with our places to make them closer to and identifiable to the catchments and the people that could and should engage with them. On that basis, we'll wrap up with what we're saying, and we'll try and identify.
Simon brutally put himself on mute to wrap himself up there, but you did go on mute briefly, Simon.
Right. Apologies. I'm not quite sure where I cut myself off, actually.
You said you're going to wrap up and then just mute.
I was going to wrap up. Yeah, no, sorry. No, we'll just now try and answer some of the questions which you've raised in the chat box. Thank you, Alex. Apologies.
Ian, your first question links in quite nicely with that in terms of what a local authority is doing to address that. And a first example would be Stockton-on-Tees, which are doing exactly what Simon said, have recognised that that town is probably, in the football analogy that Simon used, a league above, or maybe even 2 leagues above where it needed to be. And they're addressing that they bought one of the shopping centres and plan to turn it into public realm, which will right size and turn it into a successful, convenient location. Another example of that would probably be Maidenhead, which are are doing with third-party capital in terms of with Aureli, but are engaging with them with exactly the same theory to produce a successful town with a good diversified complementary uses.
Bobby, I think you've raised a number of points in your question, which I'll try and address in respect to our local authorities going to drop business rates to help fill up vacant shops. I think there's a central government funding issue around that, and obviously there have been some changes which have been made certainly in the short term to try and help do that, and obviously there've been the planning changes which are coming through as well to allow more flexibility. I wouldn't be alone in participants in this call in backing a change to the business rate system and an overhaul, because it doesn't create a fair playing field, and it is a barrier, particularly with the historic rateable values. It's definitely a barrier to affordability and to reletting. So yes, I'd be promoting that. I think that the biggest key, particularly with changes in planning consent, are ones where it's strategically thought about how we're going to implement alternative uses, and that we don't exacerbate the problem by infilling cheap, low quality residential in a retail environment or a leisure or town centre environment, that it creates almost a staccato effect to the high street, where you move where there's no continuity. And actually my concern would be that residential becomes the easy answer, not the right answer, and that it creates a lack of attraction rather than the positive that it could or should be.
Alex, you're probably best to answer the next question from Mittal in terms of, as an independent retailer, and we find agents and landlords are still pricing units according to size of units and footfall. Probably a good opportunity for you to discuss the work you're doing with your new rent.
Yeah, I think I did see that one. I think it's something I would agree with. We've seen the consumer completely change the way in which they're engaging, and even pre-COVID and pre-pandemic, we had been saying for some time that the lease model as it exists historically is fundamentally broken, because it's based on a world in which you could only transact with a brand in a store. So the idea that you just valued a store and that you had that the store's only role was to facilitate the transaction between a customer and a brand meant that you were always going to have an erosion of value when more and more customers started transacting online. And it didn't recognize what the value of the store is, which is actually more than just a transaction. It's a touch point, it's a connection, it's a point at which brands can effectively talk to their customers and build brand equity with them. And one of the things that we have been advocating for some time is that leases need to move away from that historic model and start moving towards a model which better values a store on the basis of what it can deliver to the customer. So that means and that from a landlord's perspective means taking on a greater degree, potentially taking on a greater degree of risk, so that you have a lease in which a greater proportion of that lease varies, and you have one tranche of that which might vary according to sales which go through the till. You might have another tranche which varies according to the landlord in the centre delivering the right sort of people you expect them to come. And you might have another tranche which then is looking at what the online sales are within the catchment. By having those different layers, it means that if a town or a location isn't delivering a brand's customers, and it isn't delivering the engagement that a brand needs because footfall is falling, or because people aren't coming, or because the wrong sorts of people for that brand are coming, then actually the rent decreases accordingly. Equally, if the brand is performing very well, then the rent grows to reflect that. And I think historically there has been a real battle that takes place between landlords and retailers, and that's created this degree of animosity which is built up. And what we need to do is we need to be using the crisis we have now to change that model, because if that model doesn't change, all the things we've talked about brands evolving, about towns evolving and centres evolving, they can't really happen. They can't happen until people are pulling in the same direction and are equally incentivized to move forward. And that's sort of where I feel that we need, so I've just seen Mittal's second comment. I can't say that all landlords are doing this. I would certainly advocate for all landlords to do this. I would stress actually that those deals need, and I believe they should be, more than just turnover based. If you have a brand which also has online sales, they need to reflect that as well. One of the things I would say, and I think this is particularly relevant to Mitchell's question and to everything we've talked about, is that if we want to get more locals and more independents into town centres, we do have to have that flexibility on lease, because if you are an independent operator, signing up for a 5-year upward only rent review fixed deal is going to be a challenge. And in dislocated centres where you have lots and lots of landlords, you're going to struggle to get that degree of coordination. It's a sort of coordination that is best delivered by, or more easily delivered by either coordinated bids who can get the landlords pulling in the same direction, or by managed assets. The challenge you have is that those managed assets, say shopping centres, are trying to hold up value, and it's not an easy fix. But there is a middle ground, which is taking that overspacing we've talked about and allocating some of that overspacing to flexible leases to promote those independents, because that will drive engagement, that will drive footfall, and that will drive spend, and that spend will shore up spend in the bigger operators as well, who will shore up the value. So we do need to have that flexibility, but it absolutely has to be led by everybody in a location pulling together. And for towns, that is a challenge, and I recognise that's a challenge, because you have got disconnected spaces and disconnected ownerships. And in those locations, you really need to rely on bids and town councils to pull everyone in the same direction and have a very clear vision.
Alison, Simon Morris, I'll try and answer your question around how can local authorities help reimagine locations within towns when ownerships are fragmented and it can't be controlled through the planning process. And that is one of the most difficult things to do. I went to Belgium a couple of years ago to resurgence, which has been Pilgrims' poster child, I suppose, for looking at the implementation of the Grimsey report. I don't really want to comment or go into too much of what's right and wrong about that, but I think one of the things that resurgence have done very well is that they've been able to create a strong local engagement with owners. So they've created that scenario where they've got all local owners of properties in the town centre, which includes funds, to attend monthly meetings and buy into and agree to the strategy that they had for the town centre. Now, that was about forcing occupation. One of the elements that they had, which of course we don't have, is they were able to be more flexible with a stick and carrot approach, where they were able to use grants to help people, help the landlord where they were maybe undertaking a letting at a lower rent than might have done otherwise, or to somebody who they felt was a more junior business, to help put that degree of security in place for the landlord, whilst also providing assistance on fit out for the occupier as well. At the same time, for landlords that wouldn't participate in the process, they used a system of effectively local taxation in order to, inverted commas, fine that landlord to help encourage them to toe the line of the others. Now, clearly, we don't have that so much flexibility, although the grant system is something which could be considered. But a lot of what they did was about sharing the vision. They created the vision, they presented it, and forced landlords to buy into that and to be accountable for delivering that. And I think that is something which can be translated here. It requires effort and it requires resource, and local authorities are under resourced, and they struggle to achieve the funds, particularly currently, to allocate time and resource to that type of project. But I think it's essential, because town centres are the lifeblood of our places, and we need to find a way of making them sustainable and successful in the long term.
Simon, there's one other point I would just add to that, which I think is also worth flagging, and it comes back to the overspacing point. That We're talking about there needs to be a change of use, and that doesn't apply to every unit equally within a town and within a location. So what you would fully expect to see in many of those locations is a contraction. And if you have, and I'm thinking a little bit here of Mrs. Landlord, if you have landlords who are refusing to engage and refusing to take on that independence, who are in the outer edges of a town or in secondary locations, they are ultimately going to find themselves without tenants, because those tenants will migrate into where the retail is and where the retail action is, and that is in the town centre. And equally, those landlords who have that degree of flexibility and can see that a vibrant operator who drives footfall and drives engagement is someone you want to invest in, they will see longevity and income. So there is a degree to which landlords also need to think a little bit less about what's in front of them on the table now, and a little bit about what's going to be in front of them on the table in 5 years' time. And in 5 years' time, as a landlord, you want to be looking at someone who's desperate for a lease renewal, not someone who's desperate to get out of a lease. I think there's the degree to which that has to come into play as well. The market should force the more recalcitrant landlords to toe the line that the council are trying to push. Just looking at Jess's most recent question, do you perceive there's a difference in the impact as you detailed within rural towns and coastal locations? I think there is potentially a difference between coastal locations and rural towns, but I would reiterate the point that not every location is equal, and not every location is the same. Brighton as a coastal location is a very, very different town to Southend, which is a very different town to Bournemouth, for example. So you do have different demographics which shape those towns and shape those locations. What I do think is a key point and a key thing to bear in mind is that if it is a coastal location that does have a number of visitors who come from beyond the catchment, then actually there's an opportunity there to make sure that whatever you are delivering in a town centre engages and facilitates with those visitors as well as the local community. There are alternatively local towns and local coastal towns where you don't have those visitors. Equally, you take somewhere like Keswick, rural town, rural location, Windermere, those are also big tourism destinations. And so they will have the same challenge as well. So it is very much about the uniqueness of each town and reflecting what is in those towns. But you will, interestingly, also have a different dynamic between who is visiting and who lives there. And that's quite an interesting dynamic as well.
Thank you, and hopefully that was interesting for everyone. We're gonna try and do another one of these before the end of the year to have a revisit and review our predictions, but also be able to provide the latest updates, because this is, I think everyone understands, is going to be an evolution, especially over the next couple of years. So we're coming up to the hour now. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully everyone found it helpful and insightful.